The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.
Welcome to today's webinar. As Denise said, we're focusing today on post-secondary transition. Really, what do we do with our young people on the autism spectrum when they are done with high school and they're ready for what's next? The focus I'll have today is largely on those who we envision going to college, working independently, and eventually being able to live with moderate levels to low levels of support. Hold on. Oh, I should say, I plan to talk for about 45 minutes. That should leave about 15 minutes for questions. As Denise said, I'm the founder and director of the Center for Autism Assessment and Treatment. I'm also a researcher where I've done work for the last 7 years at the National Institutes of Mental Health, and I also maintain private practice as a pediatric neuropsychologist. I'll tell you that most of the ideas that we're talking about today have come from a combination of clinical work and research work. Through our Center for Autism Assessment and Treatment, we have developed what we call the Young Adult Transition Program. Many of the ideas, especially some of the more novel ones, come through collaborations with my close colleagues at the center, Dan Griffin, Hope Harris-Black, and Monica Werner, who's also the head of the Model Asperger program at the Ivy Mountain School here in the Washington, D.C. area. Okay. So before we go too much further, let me give you a quick lay of the land. We are going to spend just a minute or two acknowledging the rates of autism, what's happened over the last many years, talk a little bit about, again, a slide or two about what happens when kids grow up and they complete high school or they complete sort of the formal part of primary education. And then from there, we're going to talk about what can we do to really to better distinguish and understand what's not going quite right, and how can we really help our kids move on a good trajectory toward productive, independent, happy, and fulfilled lives. Okay, so I suspect most of you know the rate of autism is estimated to be around 1%. There was a study out of South Korea a couple of years ago that I thought was well done that estimates the rate to be higher, perhaps closer to 2.5%. We know that it affects boys much more than girls, and in a bit of a flip over the last 40 years, the rates of intellectual disability in autism have flipped. It used to be the majority of individuals diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder also had an intellectual disability, and now what we're seeing is the majority do not. The ranges are anywhere from 50 to 70%, but about 60% have intellectual functioning above, sort of in the low average to average or much higher range. We know that the rates of autism have increased significantly over the past 15 years, as this slide shows, just going from 1996 all the way to 2007. We see the rates per thousand has really skyrocketed. So why is this so important? It's important, of course, on a family or an individual level, and some of that may be self-evident, but I think it's worth distinguishing why we care so much about this, because I think some of the reasons are not always articulated. There's an enormous cost to the individual with autism let me take a step back. This in my sentence, why is this so important? Why is it so important that we help our young people with autism become as independent and as capable and as sort of productive as possible? Why is that so important? I think, first of all, because the lack of personal fulfillment, the lack of quality of life that comes from being underemployed, from not spending your time doing what you care about, what you're passionate about, it comes at an enormous personal cost. There's a cost to the family in terms of psychological and emotional strain and struggle that happens with parents and other loved ones. Estimates suggest that the financial cost to families over the course of lifetime could be as much as $3.4 million in treatment and in lost wages. And I think the cost to society is also enormous. The data that was reported by Autism Speaks, but I think was done by David Mendel, suggested that the cost to society could be 126. I saw another statistic that said $137 billion annually. But what I think is even more important than that is the lost contribution to society. My experience working with young people with autism spectrum disorders is they have enormous potential. They think about the world, they understand aspects of how the world works within their areas of expertise in ways that I think are unique, distinct, and hold the potential to provide enormous contribution to society. That's something I think we don't articulate enough, and I think it's something that we have a duty and a responsibility to do something about. And I think that helps to capture why I'm so passionate about this particular topic. Okay. So here is what is probably a bit of a discouraging statistic, but I promise you the majority of our talk today is going to be focused on reasons to be optimistic. So this was a study, this is sort of data I extracted out of a study done by Pat Howland back in 2004, in which she reviewed the rates of individuals that have poor or very poor, fair, or good or very good outcomes. In 1970, we saw that good or very good outcomes were well under 20%. And we see that it gradually ticks up. I'm assuming you all can see my mouse as I'm hovering, but that it ticks up gradually. By 1992, we see the rates of good or very good outcomes hitting 25%, and then it sort of stays there. And we see it drop down again in this Smallwood study. I don't think that's significant. I don't think there's actually a drop. I think what we're seeing is just different methodological approaches to capturing good or very good outcomes. So what I want you to take from this is that we've made progress over the last 30 years, but of course we know there's a long way to go yet. Okay, so from here I want to focus on what I would call, what are we up against? What are the challenges to a successful transition, a transition to being as independent as possible, to having a life that is one that you would choose for yourself, meaning that you are doing what you want professionally, you are spending your leisure time in ways that are valuable to you, and that you are managing the mundane but necessary parts of life as successfully as possible. How do we make that happen? So first of all, what happens after high school? In general, autism symptoms improve, anxiety levels often decrease, but for those without an intellectual disability, progress tends to stagnate. This is a very busy slide. Just try to follow my mouse and we'll look at each square very briefly. Here's what we're looking at. This is data that was done by Taylor and Seltzer in JAD about 3 years ago, and again, just bear with me. So the 0 point, if you can follow my mouse, I'm in the top left-hand bar. The 0 point is the point when you graduate high school. The -1, -2, -3 is time until graduation. So -1 would be you're a senior, +1 would be you are 1 year post-high school. So these are autism symptoms, and this is repetitive behaviors. The lines with squares show individuals without intellectual disability. And what we see is a steady decrease in repetitive behaviors during the high school years until you graduate high school. And then we see that there's still a decrease, but the rate of improvement, or the decrease in repetitive behaviors, really flattens out quite a bit. This is what I'm referring to as stagnation. We see that trend repeat itself in the presence of impairments in social reciprocity. So again, we see symptoms improve, but then the rate of improvement stagnates. Nothing worsens, but it stagnates. We see the same thing in nonverbal communication behavior and in verbal communication behavior. So again, we see a reduction in impairment. I know it's sort of funny to say it backward like that. A reduction in impairment, and then we see it sort of flatten out. The question is, what's happening when we finish high school? There's nothing magical about finishing high school from a biological standpoint or developmental standpoint. What's happening is there's a difference in how the individual with autism is living his or her life. What is happening on a day-to-day basis? Okay. So sort of a sobering reality check is what this slide is about. Even those with average range intelligence, many remain dependent on others. Few have long-term relationships. Many are unemployed or underemployed, and anxiety and mood disorders are quite common. Perhaps more significantly is there are poor adaptive skills. Now, I define adaptive skills a little bit more broadly than sometimes we think about. We routinely think about adaptive skills as our activities of daily living, such as personal care, maintaining the home, and navigating in the community. But there's a more fundamental aspect of adaptive functioning, which is your capacity to really take charge of your life, to be planful, goal-oriented, to anticipate problems as they arise, to identify areas of growth you need in order to reach your own goals. Recognizing the steps that are needed to accomplish tasks, I would say all of this is part of adaptive functioning. Fundamentally, can I, number one, distinguish what it is I want to be doing with my life? I want to be a computer programmer. I want to be a biologist. I want to be a farmer. Whatever it is I want to do, can I articulate what I want to do? Can I recognize the difference between where I'm at now and what I need to do to get there? That's in the very broad frame. In the narrower frame, it might be something like, I really want to begin dating in the next year or so. can I recognize and identify the differences between the skills I would need to be ready to date, say in 6 months, and the skills that I have now? And then can I begin to break down and think about the tasks that are implicit in becoming ready to date? That requires very good executive functioning skills and good social cognition. Now, I want to take a minute here and mention a couple of things. We have 45 minutes, and I really want to focus on transition. And so what you're going to see is I'm going to be referring to some concepts like executive functioning and social cognition that are commonly discussed. There's a deep, rich literature about in sort of autism empirical research, but I'm not going to spend very much time explaining at this point. If there are specific questions about that at the end, I'm happy to take them. But just in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into a lot of those details. Okay. Here's another way to think about the trouble I'm talking about with adaptive functioning. This is a study I did 8 years ago with Lauren Kenworthy and some of our other colleagues at Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And what this shows is the scores on measures of intelligence for a group of children and adolescents with an autism spectrum disorder. The green line is the Asperger group. The red line is the group that we diagnosed as having high-functioning autism. To the far left, we see that in the Asperger group, their overall level of intelligence is slightly above average, and in the autism group, their overall level of intelligence is solidly average. When we compare it to their adaptive behavior or their adaptive functioning, though, we see that their adaptive functioning is significantly below the level we would expect given their intellectual functioning. So what that's telling me is that what that is telling me is that it is more than just a measure of intelligence that is impacting our adaptive functioning or the independent living skills. There's something else. And something you may not know, my guess is many of you are very well aware of the gap between levels of intelligence and levels of adaptive functioning for individuals on the autism spectrum. What you may not know, though, is that this pattern does not hold for other developmental disabilities like mental retardation or intellectual disability, as we call it now, genetic disorders, other types of conditions. In most of those conditions, there's a very high correlation between intelligence and adaptive functioning. There's something distinct and specific about autism spectrum disorders that makes adaptive functioning more challenging. I've got some ideas about what that is and what we can do about it. But this problem about transitioning to adulthood, having a successful transition, is not unique to autism spectrum disorders. So these next bullets are about people in general. So young people today, by and large, have fewer practical skills than they had 20 years ago. Their planning, organization, and self-direction skills are all areas of need more so than they were in the past. We often hear families talking about their children sort of failing to launch or taking gap years, patterns that are really different than they were 20 years ago. My point is that in part what we're tackling are some of the unique challenges of individuals with autism spectrum disorders, but we also are responding to a more general societal challenge, which is developing, helping our kids develop the readiness to run their own lives. Okay, so how do we proceed? How do we create more good outcomes? How do we get those bars to where those beige areas are to the 50–75% range, get more people independent, running their lives, living their lives the way they want to? Well, number one, we need to check a few assumptions. First of all, autism spectrum disorders are very broad, and each person is very unique. I'm sure many of you have heard this quote from Stephen Shore: if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. It's a way to say that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There is a broad range of personalities, areas of interest and ambition. The intellectual and language aptitudes of individuals with ASD vary widely. Their social interest, social motivation, and social competence vary widely as well. But I want to underscore there's very much in common among folks with autism spectrum disorders as well as folks, just people in general. In my experience, all people fundamentally want to have a sense of human connection, to be happy, to be productive, to feel fulfilled. But what does happiness itself really look like? Despite what your kids might tell you, happiness is not simply playing video games and having as much unstructured time as we can tolerate as parents. All people fundamentally have a drive to contribute, to feel productive, to achieve mastery, and to have autonomy. But here's the thing. Very often we don't see that, we don't see these drives among our young people with autism spectrum disorders. Why not? Well, there may be more pressing psychological needs, like difficulty with anxiety, stress, feeling overloaded. I'll talk about this a bit more later on. Difficulty with motivation, which I'm distinguishing from drive to a degree, and again, we'll unpack this some more as well. Trouble with self-regulation, kind of getting myself to do what I need to do when I need to do it, getting myself to bed on time, getting myself to switch tasks from playing video games to getting my homework done, things like that. Trouble with executive functioning, which as you can hear is closely yoked to self-regulation. Deficits in social cognition. This is a big component of it. Difficulty being able to sort of visualize and think about the social world around me. So I'm distinguishing social cognition in this discussion from social skills and reading social situations. I'm really talking about how I make sense of the world around me, separate from perception and execution. But do I understand the perspectives and reasons and the way in which other people conduct their lives? Do I understand how I will be different 2 years from now than I am today? Can I begin to sort of think about myself as a different person than I am today? Some of this can be hard for individuals on the autism spectrum, but I believe not impossible, that there is a lot we can do to really improve this aspect of social cognition. Adaptive functioning deficits, like we've articulated already. And in some cases, I think what we're dealing with is learned behaviors. That I've met some individuals with ASDs who largely are responding to external reinforcement. That is to say that they're responding to reward and punishment. So I do my homework because that's the only way I get video games. The reason I don't get my brother is because I don't like being yelled at, etc. So instead of sort of taking it to the next level and sort of thinking about, well, what's important to me? What do I value? What do I want to spend my time doing? Beyond just sort of immediate hobbies and pastimes, sort of ways to win away the time. Okay. So at this point, I want to focus in on motivation in a little bit more detail. Let's start by talking about how I'm defining motivation. Motivation is what I would say creates and guides goal-directed behavior. It's tightly related to attention and executive functions. And there are major individual differences in motivation. Motivation is contingent on me understanding what I want, my beliefs about whether I can achieve it, my willingness and ability to persist even if it's hard, and my capacity to shift course and adapt when I run into obstacles. Self-regulation is a core component of motivation. Daniel Pink, I think, has done some just truly exceptional thinking on the topic of motivation and drive in young people and in people in general. I think a lot of that has application to autism, certainly not all of it, but a lot of it. And I think some of the fundamental beliefs about how we are sort of biologically constructed, if you will, carry over to autism. Perhaps not perfectly, but enough to help us begin to think more clearly about how to instill motivation and drive and determination in our young people with autism spectrum disorders. So Daniel Pink talks about 3 levels of motivation. The motivation to survive, which are these biological drives to keep ourselves safe, to make sure we've got enough to eat, to make sure we've got a place to sleep, that kind of a thing. Then there's extrinsic motivation, responding to external rewards and punishment. And it's worth saying that there are times where extrinsic motivation is absolutely appropriate. And in fact, there are even some situations in which extrinsic motivation produces more effective results than intrinsic motivation. But we want to understand when extrinsic motivation is useful and when we want to rely more heavily on internally driven motivation, which is intrinsic motivation. A drive for autonomy, for mastery, and for purpose. Okay. But before you can think about autonomy, mastery, and purpose, you have to feel safe. You have to feel secure. You have to feel like you're fundamentally okay. If you have autism, this is challenging. And by autism, I mean an autism spectrum disorder. And frankly, I'll emphasize that a lot of what I'm talking about here describes individuals, the way I often put it is individuals that are on or near the autism spectrum, those that struggle with social and self-regulation. So I'm not intending to distinguish between sort of classic autism or autistic disorder, but rather people in general that struggle along these dimensions. So for such individuals, the social world can be very stressful and overwhelming. Just simply being in the social world itself can be. Information and sensory overload is common. So information overload and sensory overload is common. There are frequently high levels of anxiety, and emotion regulation can be very challenging. So how do you build intrinsic motivation if what we're focusing on is simply trying to feel safe? It's sort of like imagining that you have just gone through a major hurricane, power's been out for a week, your house is okay, but you've got sort of a 1 week supply of food, and they're telling you that the food truck isn't going to come until day 5 or 6. And so you think you're going to be okay, but you're not sure. If that's your frame of reference in terms of how safe you feel, it's hard in those moments to think about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. That's the framework here. So how do we build this? How do we overcome this? Number one, we need to address our primary needs. We need to reduce anxiety. We need to get stress to manageable levels. And I've got some specific thoughts on this later on as well. We need to move beyond carrots and sticks, beyond extrinsic motivation. This is especially critical, and something I can sort of talk for an hour just about this, but it's critical as we think about our young people becoming adults. So in 4th and 5th grade, those of you that are parents, you are often using carrots and sticks to help your kids get their homework done. And you might even be doing that a little bit in junior high as well. But by the time you transition to high school, you want to be moving beyond carrots and sticks to get them to do their homework, because you're not going to go with them to college. What you need to recognize and appreciate is that there's only one part of, let me say it differently. Oftentimes what we're thinking about with education is we're thinking about helping our kids develop their reading, writing, and math skills. But there's a whole host of soft skills that have to be developed as well. My capacity to set my own schedule, to make myself work when there's other interesting things I'd rather be doing, to see the value of working for a long-term payoff. All of these skills should be developing during junior high and high school. And when they don't develop on their own, which is very common for ADHD, is common for autism spectrum disorders, and is common for many other groups of young people, parents often step in and do it for them. They ramp up structure, they provide more carrots and sticks to try to get them to get their schoolwork done. And while that may work and be effective in getting their schoolwork done, what's not happening is kids are not developing the capacity to manage themselves. It's much better to experience a small failure in 9th grade or 10th grade, failing my English class because I just wouldn't sit down and get the work done, as opposed to waiting until college to do it. So we need to move beyond carrots and sticks. The third thing we need to do is we need to develop a working model of individual strengths and weaknesses. In essence, what gets in the way of getting stuff done and taking charge of one's life? This is a long discussion, and it's a very complex discussion too. This is, I mentioned this program that we've been running out in the DC area for a while, and one of the components of it is really trying to uncover the overlap between a critical sort of psychological and practical neuropsychological skills. What is the intersection between motivation, between my understanding of my skill set? So my actual skills are important, but my perception of my skills is equally important. What is the interplay of anxiety in these other two components, my skill set and motivation? And what about self-monitoring? Do I recognize that I'm getting overwhelmed, overloaded, or overstressed? Do I recognize that I haven't eaten in 7 hours and my brain works a whole lot better if I eat in 4-hour intervals, for example? Have I noticed that I'm no longer on task and I'm doing something else? There's an interplay between anxiety and skills. There's an interplay between anxiety and motivation. If I'm so anxious just navigating the social environment, if I'm in a mainstream high school and there's 2,000 students there, and the only way I know how to navigate it is to sort of keep my head down and put on my body armor of sort of a stoic look and be carefully avoid eye contact with anybody, and that's how I weather the school day. I'm going to be tapping most of my resources, my psychological resources, just to get through the social components of the school day. So if I can dial down my anxiety in some way, if we can address some of those concerns in some way, that frees up psychological space or frees up mental energy to begin thinking about some of these other goals. The inverse is also true, though. If I feel very competent in a certain area, so if I've developed specific social skills, if I know that I'm very competent at math, if I know that that I've sort of figured out the routine for lunch, and I feel that I can confidently navigate it, my anxiety diminishes. When my anxiety diminishes, my brain works better, and I can better leverage my skill set. The idea here is that these skills are bidirectional and they have a reciprocal influence on one another. By understanding going back to this, by developing a working model of an individual's strengths and weaknesses and understanding the reciprocal relationship these components have on a person's functioning, you can affect greater change more rapidly. Okay. I alluded to this earlier, and I want to come back to it again now. This question of, for many individuals with autism spectrum disorders, they don't know what they want. There's a young man I'm working with now who is pursuing a degree in college at sort of the recommendation of his parents. He's become a studious student. He gets his homework done. He's compliant. He does what's asked of him. But he very rarely thinks beyond, what am I supposed to do? This question of what do I want to do beyond play video games or watch my favorite TV shows. Thinking about, well, what do I want with my life is something that is very hard for him to conceptualize. And I think there are many that are like this, but I don't think it has to remain like that permanently. So here are some possible reasons why individuals on or near the autism spectrum struggle with this question of, what do I want? What do I want to do with my life? Oftentimes there's a lack of a sense of personal control. I'm going to hone in on that in a few minutes. There can be a lack of curiosity beyond circumscribed interests. That is to say, I'm so endlessly fascinated by what I care about that I don't, by my area of specific interest, I don't think very much about the world around me. I don't think very much about what is my role in the world and what might be most interesting for me. For example, there was one young man, maybe 24 years old, that I met about a year ago who loved watches. He knew everything there was to know about watches, and he also loved sort of fancy ballpoint pens. And he could read endlessly about it. But he didn't think very much about sort of what was going on around him, what is happening in the broader society, what is his role within the family, how does life around him happen, and helping him to disengage even partially from his circumscribed interests and to become more exposed to the world around him helped him to gradually think about, what do I want to do with my life? It may be that you're so overwhelmed by the day-to-day aspects of life, as I described, sort of managing just the social aspects of it, that there's a little time, there's a little energy, there's a little sort of psychological bandwidth to think beyond meeting my immediate needs. Sort of, I'm in crisis mode. So if you're chronically in crisis mode, and many on the autism spectrum are, it's very hard to begin thinking about, what do I want to do with my life? What do I want for myself? And in some cases, it might be overprotection. It might be that sort of very well-intended parents and providers have taken such steps to keep our children, who are unquestionably vulnerable, but to keep them safe from the world around them, that they have inadvertently limited their exposure to the world around them. And so it's hard for them to think about what they want because they don't know very much about it. Okay. So self-regulation, motivation is a significant aspect of what is getting in the way of our kids taking charge and running their own life. Self-regulation is another major component. The need for routine is in some parts the solution. So this is what we all know. We know that young people in general, but especially those on the autism spectrum, have difficulty with sleep. They have significant trouble managing stress. They often have trouble with emotion regulation, managing anxiety, regulating sensory input. They often have trouble prioritizing goals. This is, I need to stop playing World of Warcraft because I've got a term paper due in 6 hours. The trouble with time management and task analysis. This ties back into, I've got a term paper due in 6 hours, but I needed 12 hours to get it done. But I had no sense of it, because I don't have a sense of how long it takes me to get tasks done. I don't have a sense of where I get stuck. I don't have a sense of sort of what I need in order to be successful. So this ties into self-awareness as well. So what does the role of structure play? Post-high school, going back to those slides where we see the progress stagnates, post-high school there's often very little structure. Without a reason to get up in the morning, there's often little reason to go to bed at night. In college, for those of our kids that are in or on their way to college, there's even less structure. There's no consistent time when people go to sleep. Everything is novel and new. There's no implicit structure in general, such as there is at home. Even with young people who are living at home, essentially running their own lives, meaning that they are deciding when to get their homework done, they're taking medicine, they're scheduling their own dental appointments, etc., etc. There is still implicit structure. The household tends to go to bed at 11 o'clock. We tend to have dinner at regular intervals. There's a rhythm to how life works at home that does not necessarily carry over to living on your own or carry over to college life. And so one of the things we have to think concretely and explicitly about is, what is the role of structure? By nature, most of us structure our lives. We have regular sleep schedules. We eat at regular intervals. We have daily routines. Most of you, I'm sure, have a routine you follow for getting yourself out the door in the morning, making sure that you didn't forget your car keys, making sure that you wear shoes. I mean, some of this I realize is sort of silly, but there are routines that we follow reflexively. And it's important to articulate what those routines are and to encourage our young people to adopt similar routines. They don't need to be your routines, but they need to be routines that they can rely upon so that certain components of their lives can become automated. As I've got written here, many individuals with autism spectrum disorders may not recognize the inherent structure that is in most people's lives. So by explicitly illustrating this and making them, that is your kids, an active part of maintaining the structure of home can be instrumental in helping them see the significance and the need for it in their own life. If you've got a young person that's heading off to college or just heading to live on their own or any sort of transition, whether it's sort of a work core or anything, if you can do it, I strongly encourage you to have them practice being fully independent for a year. As I alluded to earlier, having them schedule their own appointments with the dentist, the doctor, with the tutor, having them sort of figure out how do I budget my time so that I am ready for my exams, I'm ready for I've got my papers done, all of that kind of stuff. Initially, hopefully you're starting this discussion in 7th or 8th or 9th grade, and you are establishing the schedule for them. But by high school, you want to be encouraging your young person to establish the schedule themselves. You can help them through Socratic questioning, through, if you recognize a glitch or a hole in their schedule, sometimes it's useful to let that glitch stand and let them sort of suffer the consequences, if you will, because that sort of failure feedback helps them see, oh, there's a gap. Other times you need to use Socratic questioning to help them along, but solving the problem for them often isn't particularly useful. Encourage them to schedule all aspects of their life. This is, I recommend this as much as anything to build executive functioning skills. So schedule times for meals. What if they tell you, I only need 6 minutes for breakfast, but in fact, it's 25 because of blah, blah, blah. That's a discussion point. Schedule class time, schedule study time, schedule sleep time, schedule shower time. If they've got practices they do to help manage stress, whether it's exercise or meditation or yoga, schedule that in as well. Anything that's unscheduled is leisure time. And here's the secret. When you have all of your duties scheduled, your leisure time truly becomes leisure time. Because what happens is instead of feeling guilty for playing World of Warcraft or feeling guilty for pursuing your special interest because you know that you're not getting other things done and you know that your mom's going to nag you about it or whatever else, this is time that is absolutely guilt-free. There can be freedom associated by establishing a schedule. I encourage lengthy dry runs. Leave your young adult at home for an extended period. Start for just overnight and work your way up to a week or two, providing less and less structure each time. You can feel confident that your young person is going to be able to live independently when you can go out of town for a while and not worry about a thing. They can go shopping and get what they need. They're going to take care of the house. They that they know what to do should there be an unexpected emergency like a water leak, etc. Now, it takes a while to get up to that level of independence, and in some cases that may not happen until mid or late 20s, but it can happen in many, many cases. The idea is if you take a step-by-step process and you establish these dry runs, that you can gradually approximate living independently, and much more importantly, your young person will have the experience of, I can do this. You're building confidence. Okay, I'm just going to spend a second on this slide. If you've got a young one going away to college, I strongly encourage you to arrive at campus 3 to 6 weeks early. There is so much novelty in a new setting. Everything is new that it can take a long time to just get comfortable with all of the changes. New bed, new roommate if you don't have a single dorm, different places to eat, where am I going to find my alone time, how am I going to navigate classes, etc., etc. Meeting with the Disability Support Office, meeting with your professors, meeting with your resident advisor, all of this should happen well in advance of school. Prior to the start of the semester, establish a relationship with a therapist at the counseling center. Pre-schedule at least the first 6 weeks of appointments. Much easier to cancel an appointment than to establish a relationship with a new therapist when you're already in crisis. Have organizational and study skills coach meetings weekly. Okay. Anticipate problems. Plan for there to be hiccups, there to be bumps in the road, etc. Importantly, acknowledge to yourself and and have a frank discussion with your young person that the weaknesses in social cognition may lead to misperceptions of how the world really works. I would think of this as inoculation. For example, all people need sleep, a good diet, and a healthy body to function. But there will be many students on campus that put on a facade of something else. It looks like they are going on 3-day benders without sleep, that they blow off the semester until a week before finals, and then they cram and they do fine. Chances are it's a facade. Chances are that's not how they're actually functioning, even though that's how it looks from the outside. And in rare cases, there are some people that can do that, but probably not your young person on the autism spectrum. They're going to need more routine and more structure. But because of weaknesses in social perception, in understanding that the face I'm putting forward may not be how I actually run my life, I may develop misperceptions of what a, quote, successful student should be able to do. Identify warning signs of emerging problems in advance. Have discussions about, let me say it differently. In this case, have discussions with your young person about how much they're sleeping, how much they're eating, are they getting behind on their schoolwork. The key here, as we'll talk about in another slide, is that you want your young person to be in the driver's seat, not you. So if this comes at it like, are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating enough? And if it feels like they're being nagged, they probably are going to push back and not want to engage in those discussions with you. So there's a lot of advanced work that has to happen before we reach that stage, where the communication is such that you are seen as the coach, you're not seen as the nagging parent. By being the coach, then you want to think about metaphors where, you know, a tennis player or a hockey player or whoever often looks to their coach for further guidance on how to get better at whatever it is, whatever skill they're trying to develop. If they see you in the role of coach, them in the role of running their life, oftentimes you can diminish a lot of the tension that exists in that parent-child relationship. It's not easy to, but it can be done. And when it can't be done, then you want someone else to step in as that person that's helping with some of the early monitoring. Have regular check-ins, and I would encourage practicing role-playing, asking for help. When you go to your professor's office hours, when you go to the counseling center, when should you check in with the disability support office? Practice this in high school as much as possible. Have this be an explicit part of that high school IEP in terms of building self-advocacy skills. Here's a quick slide on managing stress and reducing anxiety. To reduce anxiety, typically increasing structure helps. Reducing the ambiguity of situations helps a lot. Having a healthy lifestyle. In this case, I'm talking about regular sleep schedule, healthy diet, routine exercise, and ways to manage stress, which you're seeing on the other side here with meditation or yoga, modes of self-expression. Psychotherapy, of course, is an important component. And having a social connection with others, feeling like you're connected to another person, even if it's just your parents, but connected to somebody that you feel understands you, is really important. And the thing I don't have on here that, of course, is often important is medication. Sometimes you need to be working closely with a psychiatrist to help manage high levels of anxiety. The only thing to add on the managing stress side is having reasonable expectations. This ties into self-monitoring on that getting things done pie I showed you a little while ago, and it also ties into understanding oneself. How much work can I reasonably do? If you know, for example, that you're someone that can pull an all-nighter to meet a work deadline and you can function the next day, that's one thing. If you know that if you don't get your 6 hours of sleep, it doesn't matter how far behind, that everything's going to be a mess, that's self-awareness, that's understanding who you are. Some people can push through with only a couple hours of sleep, other people can't. You need to know that about yourself. Your young person needs to know that about themselves. Okay. It's essential to put them in charge. Here's what I mean. Or here's why I think it's important. I'll talk about what I mean in a second. A sense of personal control is protective and empowering. There's a very strong body of research that illustrates this. You want to instill a belief and expectation of independence. Messages like, I know you can figure it out. I'm here for you, but I know you'll sort it through. Sometimes you need to give a message like, I don't want to weaken you by doing it for you. Allow, and in some cases encourage, small failures earlier in life. Recovering from them teaches children that they can pick themselves up and move on. For a great discussion of this, I encourage you to read Blessing of a Skinned Knee by Wendy Mogul. She also, there's some stuff on the internet that you can, sort of webinars like this that you can watch as well. Being protected from early failures creates brittle self-confidence and hampers resilience. The key here is you want to measure it and control it. So if I experience a small failure and I pick myself up and I persevere. What I just learned is that I can overcome adversity, that I can do it myself, and that I can push forward. You want your kids to have serial experiences of this. Here's more on this topic. This is talking about a locus of control. An internal locus of control conveys the idea that the outcomes, or sort of my life, how my life goes, is ultimately under my control. An external locus of control is the idea that I have very little control over my own destiny. So this ties back to this idea of what do I want to do with myself and motivation. If I feel that I've got little control over how I spend my time and my day and my week, it's hard for me to then think about my own destiny because I feel like it's out of my control anyway. An internal locus of control is psychologically protective. When we feel safe, secure, and circumstances are ultimately predictable, we can tolerate much more stress and uncertainty around specific tasks. I think it's worth underscoring this idea of ultimately predictable. Those of us who do not have weaknesses in social cognition generally find the social scripts that most of us conduct our lives by as a way to have the world feel more predictable and more understandable. And so, in fact, social experiences and social contact increases our sense of feeling safe and secure. It's something we can rely upon, we can depend upon. We have an implicit understanding of what's going to happen next, and that allows us to feel grounded. With an autism spectrum disorder, when you have weaknesses in social cognition, it can have very much the opposite effect. Instead of life feeling predictable, having social interactions feel predictable and be a source of security, it can be something that just further reduces our sense of feeling in control. Okay. The two things I want to say here. Here, it's the idea that, so the prefrontal cortex, the frontal part of your brain, this part of your brain that focuses in on, that we use for executive functioning, for self-regulation, for those components of life, when you're stressed, that part of your brain doesn't work particularly well. When your stress level is fairly low, that part of your brain works significantly better. There's a whole sort of nice body of research that illustrates this. Recovering from challenges builds resilience, confidence, and motivation. It, in essence, inoculates you against certain kinds of stress. But again, it needs to be measured and metered. So there's a fine line I'm encouraging you to walk. I want you to provide support to your kids while keeping them in the driver's seat. As we've talked about repeatedly, as you know from just living life, many individuals with autism spectrum disorders lack the organizational skills and the social cognition to execute complex tasks. Social cognition deficits make it hard to visualize oneself 5 years from now. Makes it very tough to execute life, even when attainable goals are identified. So what we want to think about here is we want to help them. We want to help our young people with autism pursue their goals. We don't want to set goals for them, but we want to put ourselves in the role of coach. And oftentimes we need to do extensive work with a therapist to get to the point where our young person is willing to see us as coach. And in other cases, it just does not make sense to have the parent be coach. It's to find someone else that can serve that role. Okay. And fundamentally, I guess I want you to think about who's really in charge. Ultimately, it's your child's life, and it's up to them to decide how they want to spend it. You can't literally make someone do something against their will. You can coerce them, you can use carrots and sticks, you can encourage them, but ultimately they will decide. I think the sooner everyone sort of comes to terms with that, your young person and yourself, the power struggle shifts quite a bit. Okay. Mirror the real world. I've got a bunch of slides on this, but I want to save time for questions, so we'll go through these fairly quickly. Really what I'm talking about here is the ways in which, and I don't think this is really about autism spectrum disorders in particular, I think this is the way a lot of homes are today. In the real world, nobody pays the rent for you just because you don't feel like going to work. Dishes don't magically get done. Groceries don't just show up in the kitchen. Yet, a lot of adolescents have no sense of chores, no sense of responsibility. Parents will often say things like, their job is to be a student. As long as they're getting good grades, I'll take care of everything else. Here's the problem with that. In the real world, if the only thing you're doing is working, you're not coming home to do the dishes, you're not buying groceries, you're not maintaining the house, life doesn't really work. I know very, very few people that have the luxury of singularly focusing on one thing, my job. And when we ask our adolescents to singularly focus on academics, to think about nothing else, that doesn't really mirror the real world. Our role as parents, our role as educators, our role as treatment providers is to help our adolescents turn into competent, independent adults, to prepare them for life so they've got the soft skills that they need. And that's what I mean by trying to mirror the real world at home. So establish routines that mirror some of what we're talking about. I encourage you to involve your children in all aspects of day-to-day living. You want to start gradually and slowly increase the number of things they're responsible for. You want to provide opportunities for extensive practice with natural consequences that are small, scale, and palatable. For example, teach money management through a debit card with a low credit limit. Give not quite enough money for what you want. So your kiddo wants to buy 3 things. They're going to cost $45 total. Just give them $35 and let them sort of wrestle with, well, what do I really want? Can I get a good deal on one of these things so I can stretch my money a little bit? But if you don't create that tension, there's not much of an incentive to compel budgeting, for example. This is just underscoring some of the points I've made before. But we want to have a measured approach to this. So as we know, individuals on or near the autism spectrum are often very sensitive to anxiety and stress. A sink or swim approach I don't think is particularly useful for an emotionally sensitive person. What I mean is I want you to calibrate expectations. I want you to continually challenge your young person as progress is made. Don't flood them. Don't set them with massive expectations. Set the expectations that are just slightly beyond where they're at now. I think VYGOTSKY'S idea of the zone of proximal development illustrates this very well. If you are placing tasks that are within this zone of what he calls proximal development, the idea here is the skills down here, these are things I can do easily. So I want to help you develop skills that you can do with some scaffolding through the support of the more knowing other. And as these skills become easy, then we're going to step up again, and we're going to gradually step up. If we make the task too hard, we're going to produce anxiety. And in a person who's already anxiety sensitive, that's just not a good thing. And if we place expectations that are too low, not only do we create boredom, but we also, I think, instill complacency, and you see a lack of progress. Okay, developing self-understanding. This is something I've underscored, I think, throughout. So again, we'll go through this fairly quickly. But self-understanding about what do I love? What am I good at? What is my purpose in life? I wouldn't even think about asking this question until you're into older adolescence, or perhaps not even until your young person is in their 20s, but you do want to think about what is my purpose? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What are my blind spots? What am I likely to miss? What do I need to be successful? What kind of structural supports are needed? Use ADHD metaphors. Individuals with ADHD there are plenty out there in the world that are self-disclosed to have ADHD, and what they'll tell you is they cannot function if they don't have certain kinds of structural supports. I've got someone that gets me on time to places. I always put my car keys in a certain place. I have schedules or lists or whatever that I maintain. We all have structural supports to some degree. Some of them are just more socially accepted or socially conventional. Let's use the word conventional than others. But you need to understand what you need, and you need to help your young person understand what they need. Establishing habits and routines that facilitate this is also important. Building self-awareness can happen through self-study. I often encourage young people to read books about Asperger's or about autism spectrum disorders, and then to engage in discussions with me or in a roundtable. Psychotherapy can help. Postmortems following social successes and failures are, I think, really instructive. And provide opportunities to practice with natural, measured consequences. So, well, let's try it your way and see what happens. Oh, it didn't go very well. Let's unpack what might have gone differently. Through these experiences, you can build self-awareness. Okay, this is the last part. What is your role of parents? I think we start by asking a fundamental question. Do you work primarily to protect and keep your children safe? Of course we all do. But what also are you doing to promote autonomy and to build resilience? What is your motivation? How can I be supportive without enabling a student's lack of independence, or enabling my student's lack of independence? As I said, safety is always a primary goal, but we must also simultaneously work to foster independence, resilience, and risk tolerance. But we want to do this in measured ways. We want to calibrate to your current abilities, but continually stretch them. Again, back to this zone of proximal development idea. The point of this slide is to illustrate that your children will not grow in a vacuum, that the home environment that you create, which is going to be a function of your motivation and what you see as your role as parent, will have a trickle-down effect throughout the entire family system, throughout the household. Think of it as your job is to work yourself out of a job. I want to get to the point when my young person is ready, whether we're talking about 18 or 20 or 25 years old, to where they don't need me to run their life for them. They need me as a confidant, as a person to come to for advice, but the routine aspects of life, I am no longer needed for that. Okay. So where do you go from here? This is our last slide. You want a careful and thorough assessment of your individual strengths and weaknesses. That might be through a neuropsychological assessment. That might be through some sort of functional assessment or skills assessment. And importantly, I think you want to build self-regulation, manage anxiety, build resilience, and the motivation piece is what's not on this slide. Okay, so I think from here we're going to stop. I've left, it looks like, about 8 minutes for questions, and we'll go from there. Okay.
We've gotten a lot of them, so I'll share these with you. The first one is there a test that you can recommend to measure adaptive functioning and social cognition?
There are several measures of this. There are not many that are sensitive to what we're talking about here. The problem with adaptive functioning is there are plenty of tests like the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales or the Adaptive Behavior Assessment System that measure certain kinds of adaptive skills, communication skills, some community navigation skills, but they don't get to the point of helping you understand your young person's ability to sort of think about their life and take charge of it in the way I was talking about here. Social cognition is far more challenging. In clinic, we do this really through careful clinical interview and direct assessment. I'm not aware of standardized measures that do that very well. I mean, there are things like the ADOS, but I think it becomes insensitive to some of the challenges that are common among the kids that I've been talking about today.
Okay, next, regarding helping the young adult learn to internalize routines. As a therapist, I'll help a young adult client develop a routine and schedule in session, but they will have difficulty with follow-through between sessions. Then they are ashamed and embarrassed by their failure and are inclined to lie or minimize. I hear from parents and others that they have the same experience. 1, how do you recommend parents and other adults to provide support with task accomplishment in post-secondary young adults without micromanaging? And 2, how do you recommend helpers respond to duplicity?
Yeah, so this is the crux of it, and I'd say there's a few things. One is you plan for failure. Plan for, and I use the term failure sort of loosely. I don't mean global failure. I mean that you're going to have a hiccup along the way, that things aren't going to go masterfully the first time around. And practice using a variety of metaphors to normalize that this happens. Not that therefore we should expect to not be making steady progress, but that failure or that setbacks happen and plan for it. In terms of feeling guilty and minimizing it, I think if we see that we're working collaboratively, if we sort of normalize that it's hard, and then we do sort of a careful post-mortem, but it's not about assigning blame, like, oh, you're lazy, or what's wrong with you, or anything that would sort of imply implicitly anything along those lines, but rather trying to understand what it is that didn't go right. Was this an issue of executive functioning? Was it planning? Was it trouble with working memory? Did it slip your mind? Do we need to do something more with your, if you've got a smartphone, with giving yourself more frequent reminders? Are there not sufficiently stringent sort of natural consequences? If I'm trying to get you to do something, but there's not any real cost for you to not do it, the incentives might diminish pretty quickly. So if we can think of ways to create goals that and sort of treatment targets that facilitate independence at home, and let's replace independence with that facilitate accomplishing what you find most interesting and most important, I think it can make a big difference. Now, I don't remember if I said this, but I think it is absolutely essential that parents are heavily involved in the treatment process. The role of parents, even with young people in their 20s, And in some cases, late 20s and early 30s, the role of parents cannot be underestimated. You need to have them on board, working collaboratively with you, giving a consistent message. This is a component of how we do our young adult program out here in DC, and I think it is the only reason a primary reason that we experience some of the success that we do.
Okay, next. In any of your research or readings, do you find an increase in comorbid disabilities with ASD individuals that further impact their overall independence? For example, ADHD, anxiety disorder, etc.
Yeah, unquestionably. If you're dealing with sort of uncomplicated autism spectrum disorder, but anxiety levels are low, ADHD symptoms are largely absent, it's much easier. You must address directly the comorbid symptoms. You've got to get the anxiety to a level where the person's not paralyzed by it, and you've got to get the ADHD managed, whether that's through medicine, that's through consistent routines, or that's recalibrating expectations. But they're enormously common, and all of them, I think, have the potential to completely impair independent living. It's certainly true for people that are not on the autism spectrum, and I think it's compounded when they are. But that's not to say I think it's insurmountable. I think it is absolutely something you can tackle and overcome. And in fact, I would say most of the folks I meet are struggling with some measure of anxiety or ADHD symptoms.
Okay, next. At what age is it appropriate to start having discussions about a child's disability in order for them to understand their strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I would say it's tiered less to chronological age and more to developmental age. The metaphor I like to use is the way we try to explain sex to preschoolers, right? If your 4-year-old asks you a question about sex, you try to understand, well, what's the question, and answer simply the question. At that age, you probably don't want to give a comprehensive explanation of the birds and the bees. You want to give just a sort of a narrow explanation. So it would be the same thing through elementary school anyway, with autism symptoms or ADHD symptoms. Something along the lines of, well, everybody has things they do well and things that are harder for them, and for you it's harder to do X, but here are some other things you do really well. The good news is we've got some great ideas, or here's what we can do to improve X, whatever it is that we're identifying as the weakness. By I would say, it's sort of when you're developmentally 7th grade-ish, and that might not happen until your 10th or 11th grade, I think a fuller and franker discussion of your diagnosis is important. It needs to be done with a lot of sensitivity to the person's temperament. If this is a person who's already fragile, has low self-esteem, and tends to catastrophize anything negative, then you need to deliver that message in a very different way than someone who is sort of blasé and matter of fact. But it does need to, aspects of it need to happen during elementary school.
Okay. What is your opinion of self-disclosure in the college or work environment? Should the individual tell teachers, employers, peers, coworkers that they have autism? Pros and cons.
Yeah, well, so the pros are getting more support, getting a better understanding of what your needs might be, and having an understandable explanation for a faux pas that might be committed. So, oh, you were sort of awkward at that cocktail party. That might be because you have trouble in social situations, as opposed to you were insensitive and rude. That's what I mean in terms of pros. The cons are there's no question that there's judgment that's associated with that, and in some situations there won't be very much sort of downside, but in other situations it can be really, it can set you up in a unfortunate way. There's a piece of this that is a lot more transactional. What I mean by that is, if you have significant autism or Asperger's symptoms and you are very well suited for a particular job, but that job requires interacting with others in a way that your autism symptoms might be interfering, it might be appropriate to sort of get the job and then disclose. But it just really depends. I don't think you can take a hard and fast approach to always disclose or to never disclose.
Great, thanks. Okay, I've think we have time for just a couple more.
Okay.
The first one is, do you conduct ongoing trainings online and/or within the DC area? We need a focus in assessment and identification of ASD in relation to the changes of the DSM-5.
Yes. It sounds like this is a question about for professionals, and sure, I do a lot of those types of things in the DC area. I don't do very much online, but in terms of in-person things, there's lots of opportunities. You can, if you go to the website, which is on this screen, you see there, if you navigate to About Us, you'll see contact information.
Okay, I'll give you just one more.
Sure.
My son is 19 and he can't make a decision for himself. What spoon to use, what dish to eat out of, what plate to use, etc. I've been making him make decisions and try things to see what happens, but I feel like he will never be able to make a decision on his own. Can you encourage me?
Yeah. I do think you are. So this is anxiety in most cases. I've met a bunch of folks like this. I would say definitely progress can be made. That this may be obvious, but anxiety is most likely at the root of it, and that it may require a combination of very close collaboration with psychiatrists and with a therapist, maybe even a behaviorist, to not sort of like a strict ABA type approach, but a behaviorist to really help get it to establish habits and routines of making choices for the sake of making choices, and then just gradually expanding it. But yeah, I definitely think that progress can be made here. You may also notice, of course I don't know, but you may also notice that the challenges in this area are amplified during periods of heightened stress and anxiety. So if it's at 19, he's probably not in school, but if he were, at the beginning of the school year, at the end of semesters, during periods of time like that, I would expect that kind of decision-making to be even more difficult.
Okay, I wonder if we could squeeze in just one more. This is a really good question. It's not anything that I think we've addressed yet.
Okay.
She says, I'm a teacher and I want to help support inclusion in my classroom, but I find that the other kids simply don't want to work with kids on the spectrum. Do you have examples of successful strategies that you know of that educators have used?
I think inclusion is tricky. I would start by asking, what are your reasons for inclusion? So sometimes we have this idea that we should include every child all the time, and I think there's times where it's simply not appropriate. The idea of having appropriate peer models of exposure to typical development, I think are lofty, important goals, but just because you're in a classroom with other typically developing kids doesn't mean, unless you are at the level of having the skills to engage, it doesn't mean that you are actually, just because, I guess, being in proximity is not the same thing as actually interacting with or being included. Just because I'm in the same physical environment doesn't mean I'm really being included if I'm not able to keep up with the social demands or to keep up with the level of instruction, etc. So I think that inclusion models work when the gap isn't too wide and when you have adequate in-room support. I also think it varies quite a bit by age. So the way you include in second grade is pretty different than how you include in 11th grade. The other part of the question about including, having other students be more accepting, I find that didactic education about differences, articulation of strengths of the person who might be a little quirky or stand out in some sort of an odd way, but that he has these unusual or she has those unusual distinct strengths can really be instructive too, sort of to illustrate that this person has something to contribute that everybody can benefit from. There's a little bit of data. I looked closely at this about 3 years ago, and there's a little bit of data. I'm sorry, I can't think of any of the references now. Out of looking at second and third grade classrooms where they use these kinds of models of educating the classroom, and sometimes education was just 5 or 6 minutes, that it had trickle-down benefits with those same students in terms of being more open, more accepting, and more inclusive of any kind of difference, of any kind of diversity in junior high and high school.